Something extraordinary is unfolding just 90 miles off the coast of Florida right now. And most people have absolutely no idea how far things have already gone. In the span of just a few weeks, Cuba went dark. Literally, 2/3 of the island, including the capital, Havana, lost power in a massive blackout. Millions of ordinary Cubans sat in the dark with no electricity, no fuel, and no clear end in sight. And back in Washington, President Trump stood in front of cameras and said 6 words that sent shockwaves across the Caribbean and beyond. He said, "Cuba is going to fall pretty soon." This isn't a campaign promise from years ago. This is happening right now. Trump has taken a series of aggressive, calculated moves that have pushed Cuba to what he himself called the end of the line, and the situation is escalating faster than most political analysts predicted. Today, we're going to break down exactly how we got here, what Trump is doing, what Cuba's government is saying, and most critically, what could happen next. Because if the last few weeks are any indication, the next chapter in this story could rewrite the entire geopolitical map of the Western Hemisphere. Let's get into it. To understand what's happening today, you have to go back to January 20th, 2025, day one of Trump's second term. Before the inaugural celebrations had even ended, Trump signed a stack of executive orders. Most of the world was focused on the big ones: immigration, tariffs, energy. But buried in that pile was a decision that set the course for everything happening with Cuba right now. With the stroke of a pen, Trump reinstated Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, reversing a last-minute order signed by outgoing President Biden just days earlier. Biden had made the move as part of a Vatican-brokered deal. Cuba had begun releasing political prisoners, and for a brief moment, it looked like the two countries might inch toward détente. Trump erased all of it before the ink was dry. The move immediately reimposed tight controls on US exports to Cuba, froze Cuba's access to international financial transactions passing through American banks, reinstated visa restrictions, and blacklisted hundreds of Cuban companies, most of them linked to the military-controlled conglomerate Geisa. In one afternoon, Cuba was right back where it had been under the most intense period of Trump's first term. Cuba's Foreign Minister Bruno Rodríguez didn't hold back. He called the terrorism designation a tool of political coercion, not a genuine counter-terrorism measure. But in Washington, the mood was celebratory. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a Cuban-American who has spent decades calling for maximum pressure on Havana, was one of the loudest voices cheering the move. And that was just the opening move. If January 2025 was the beginning, then January 2026 was the moment everything accelerated. In a jaw-dropping development that still feels surreal to many people, US forces captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in early 2026 as part of what the administration called Operation Absolute Resolve. For years, Maduro had been indicted on narco-terrorism charges in American courts. Suddenly, he was in US custody. The ripple effect hit Cuba like a tidal wave. Venezuela had been supplying Cuba with roughly a third of its oil, a lifeline that kept the lights on, the buses running, and the government functioning. In exchange, Cuba sent medical personnel and security advisors to prop up Maduro's government. It was a mutually dependent relationship that had sustained both regimes for over a decade. With Maduro captured, Trump immediately announced that no further Venezuelan oil or financial resources would flow to Cuba. Done. Finished. Over. The supply chain that had kept Cuba alive was severed almost overnight. But Trump wasn't done. On January 28, 2026, he went even further. He signed an executive order declaring Cuba a national emergency and established a mechanism to impose tariffs on any country in the world that supplied oil to Cuba, directly or indirectly. It was a warning shot heard around the globe: if you sell oil to Cuba, you'll pay a price. Suddenly, Cuba had nowhere left to turn. For months, the pressure built quietly. Fuel reserves declining, power plants struggling, the Cuban government scrambling to find alternative suppliers. Most of the world wasn't paying much attention. And then came March 4th, 2026. On that Wednesday, something broke. A critical failure at the Antonio Guterres thermoelectric plant, Cuba's largest electricity provider, triggered a cascading collapse across the national grid. Within hours, 2/3 of Cuba went dark. From the central province of Camagüey all the way to Pinar del Oro in the west, including Havana, millions of people sat in complete blackout. Cuba's national electricity company confirmed the scope of the outage on social media. Prime Minister Manuel Marrero Cruz was photographed in an emergency meeting with the Minister of Energy, trying to piece together what happened and how fast power could be restored. Government radio warned it could take at least 72 hours to restore operations. On the streets of Havana, frustration boiled over. Protests erupted across the island in the days following the blackout. Ordinary people who had already endured years of hardship reaching a breaking point. An elderly Havana resident named Ernesto Martinez, 76, captured the mood perfectly when he told reporters, "We must keep fighting. There's no other way. We have to go forward or no." But the most direct statement came from Cuba's own electricity authority. When a reporter asked whether the blackout was a direct result of the US oil blockade, the official's answer was unambiguous: exactly. The lights had literally gone out, and that fact alone sent a powerful signal to Washington. The day after the blackout, on March 5, 2026, Trump sat down for an interview and made his position crystal clear. "Cuba is going to fall pretty soon," he said. And he wasn't speaking in hypotheticals. He was speaking like someone who believed the outcome was already determined, like a chess player who sees checkmate 3 moves ahead. Trump described the Cuban leaders as people who want to make a deal so badly, and he said he expected to be celebrating developments in Cuba very soon. Then he did something that told you everything about the strategy. He assigned Secretary of State Marco Rubio to take the lead in any negotiations with the Cuban government. Think about what that means for a moment. Rubio is Cuban American. His family left Cuba before the revolution, and he has spent his entire political career as one of the most vocal and consistent critics of the communist regime in Havana. Putting Rubio in charge of talks isn't just a diplomatic move, it's a statement. It's a signal to the Cuban government and to the Cuban American community in Florida that this administration is serious. Just 2 days later, on March 7, Trump took the stage at the Shield of the Americas conference in Miami, a gathering of Latin American leaders who have increasingly aligned with Washington and drove the message home even harder. They are looking to negotiate, Trump told the crowd. They are in talks with Marco, myself, and several others. I believe that a deal could be easily established with Cuba. The audience erupted, and the world took notice. Here's where things get genuinely complicated and genuinely interesting. The word deal is being used a lot, but what does a deal with Cuba actually look like? What does Trump want? What is Havana offering? And is any of this actually happening in good faith? Reports indicate that US officials held quiet meetings with Raul Castro's grandson in February 2026, a remarkable development that flew under the radar for weeks. The conversations reportedly explored what it would take for the US to ease sanctions. The answer from Washington, according to sources familiar with the discussions, significant political changes, starting with the exit of President Miguel Diaz-Canel. One prominent analyst was blunt about it: the administration does not see any aspect of the current Cuban government as a viable partner. They want Diaz-Canel out, but there's a more nuanced view from the economic side. Some experts argue that what Trump actually cares about is economic reform, not necessarily political transformation. According to this view, Trump is largely indifferent to whether a government is authoritarian or democratic. What he wants is a government capable of managing the economy and importing American goods and services. That framing sounds cold-blooded, but it also might explain why negotiations are happening at all, because if Cuba's government could somehow restructure its economy in a way that opens the door to American trade, Trump might accept a deal that doesn't look like regime change on paper, even if it functionally dismantles the system from within. Some in the Cuban exile community are deeply skeptical. One analyst warned that negotiations could dilute real change, arguing that Cuban leaders will drag out any talks as long as possible to stay in power. They don't care about the people, he said. They care about staying in power. The shape of any deal remains murky, but the fact that talks are happening at all is unprecedented. Inside Washington, the Republican Party is essentially unified behind the pressure campaign, and several prominent voices are going even further than Trump himself. Rep. Carlos Gimenez, a Florida Republican of Cuban descent, captured the mood among GOP hardliners perfectly. Cuba is at its lowest point in 65 years, he told reporters. Cuba is collapsing under its own incompetence, under its own weight. He added, without hesitation, we can convert Cuba from an adversary to a friend of the United States, and it will happen. Senator Rick Scott of Florida went even further, predicting on the record that the Cuban regime could fall in 2026 or 2027. and reports surfaced that the Trump administration has been quietly searching for Cuban insiders who could help execute a more direct change of government, something that, if confirmed, would represent a level of covert intervention not seen in decades. Kevin Cooper, chairman of the Miami-Dade Republican Party, was equally blunt. They should be sleeping with their pajamas on, he said of Cuban regime leaders. It is time to bring freedom to the people of Cuba. The Cuban American community, roughly 2.4 million strong across the United States, concentrated heavily in Florida, has long supported a hard line against Havana. That community delivered Florida to Trump in both 2020 and 2024. Their enthusiasm for the current pressure campaign is a political fact of life that shapes every decision this administration makes on Cuba. But this optimism from Republicans stands in sharp contrast to what's happening on the ground right now. The human situation inside Cuba is deteriorating rapidly, and the pace of deterioration is accelerating. Analysts warned this week that Cuba could completely exhaust its remaining fuel supplies by mid to late March 2026. Meaning right now, as you're watching this, if that happens, the country wouldn't just experience rolling blackouts. Public transportation would stop, waste collection would cease, hospitals would lose backup power. The infrastructure that holds a society together would begin to fail systematically. Cuba's growing international isolation makes the situation more precarious. The island has historically relied on allies like Venezuela, Russia, and China to offset American pressure. Venezuela is now under US influence following Maduro's capture. Russia is stretched thin by its own international conflicts. And even Latin American nations that once maintained friendly ties with Havana have increasingly realigned toward allies like Venezuela, Russia, and China to offset American pressure. Venezuela is now under US influence following Maduro's capture. Russia is stretched thin by its own international conflicts. And even Latin American nations that once maintained friendly ties with Havana have increasingly realigned toward Washington. Trump described Cuba as the icing on the cake, a phrase he used to place Cuba in a sequence that began with Venezuela and passed through Iran. The situation in Cuba is remarkable, he told reporters. We believe we should wrap up this one first, but it will merely be a matter of time. The sequence matters. Venezuela fell. Iran was targeted. Cuba is next. And Trump has made clear he views these as connected chapters in a single story. CNN's Dana Bash asked him directly, Cuba is going to collapse soon? His answer was immediate and unequivocal, yes. So here's the question everyone is actually asking. What does the endgame look like? There are essentially three paths from here, and each one leads somewhere dramatically different. The first is a negotiated deal. Cuba's government, facing fuel collapse and international isolation, agrees to significant concessions. Diaz-Canel steps aside or accepts reforms. Sanctions are gradually lifted. American trade resumes. Cuba transforms economically, becoming, in Trump's framing, a place capable of doing business with the United States. This is the scenario Trump seems to be publicly betting on. Some analysts describe it as optimistic, bordering on naive. The second is a slower unraveling. The regime holds on, refuses to negotiate meaningfully, and Cuba enters a prolonged humanitarian crisis, power outages, food shortages, fuel depletion, while Washington maintains maximum pressure. The population suffers. Protests grow. The regime eventually fractures from within, leading to an uncontrolled transition. This is the scenario Cuban American hardliners privately fear most, change that comes too slowly and at too great a cost to the Cuban people. The third path is the most dramatic and the least discussed publicly, some form of direct US intervention. Trump has referenced his actions in Venezuela and Iran openly when talking about Cuba, describing Cuba as coming after them. Reports of the administration searching for Cuban insiders willing to help with regime change suggest that more covert preparations may already be underway. And notably, when reporters asked Rubio directly about military action in Cuba, he declined to answer. "Four of you mentioned it, you do me a favor, take care of it." "I'll take care of it," Trump said cryptically at the Miami conference, prompting applause. What exactly taking care of it means in this context, nobody is saying out loud. Here's where things stand right now. In the span of 14 months, Trump reinstated Cuba's terrorism designation, severed its oil supply, declared Cuba a national emergency, threatened tariffs on any nation that helps Cuba survive, and publicly predicted the regime's imminent collapse, all while assigning his Secretary of State to broker what could become one of the most consequential deals in Western Hemisphere history. Cuba is dark, literally and figuratively. 2/3 of the island lost power just days ago. The fuel clock is ticking. Protests are spreading, and somewhere in Washington, negotiations are quietly happening with people connected to the Castro family. Whether this ends with a deal, a collapse, or something, nobody is predicting yet. One thing is undeniable: the United States and Cuba are closer to a fundamental transformation of their relationship than at any point in over 60 years. Trump called it the icing on the cake. But for 12 million Cubans sitting in the dark right now, wondering if their fuel runs out before any deal gets done, this is anything but dessert. Whether this pressure campaign liberates Cuba or deepens its suffering, the world will find out very soon.